Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Catherine Bliss. I'm the Associate Director of the Restorative Lab based here at Dalhousie University. I want to start before we get started with a short land acknowledgement to recognize that both Dalhousie University and the Restorative Lab are located in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And so I think most of us, as we sit and listen to Donna's talk, will sort of acknowledge the significance of that, especially in the work that we do. And as someone new to this particular territory, I continue to sort of learn and appreciate, and I'm grateful to be able to both work and live in this wonderful place. So welcome, everyone. This is exciting because this is our first in-person lecture in our second annual series of Fellows and Associates lectures. We're pleased to welcome Donna Coker, who's the International Visiting Fellow to the lab this year. And I'll be introducing someone to give a short bio of Donna next. But I just wanted to, for those who are joining us maybe for the first time and who don't know much about the lab, I just wanted to give a quick overview of the Restorative Lab as the host of this series, and to also thank the Criminal Justice Coalition here at the law school, who's co-hosting this event with us. So the Restorative Lab was founded in 2020 here at Dalhousie University, and it's both a physical and virtual lab space that works towards increasing knowledge, education, and research in the area of a restorative approach to justice. We're pleased that this lecture series forms part of our mandate to increase education in this area, and we look forward to hopefully a good dialogue here, that we have people in person and online. Just a quick note that this is a hybrid event. So we have a nice group of people here in the room. For those of you online, welcome as well. We have a number of people online. We also will be recording this event, and we have quite a good number of people who tend to tune in when this becomes available on YouTube. So please feel free to spread the word and let people know that there's some wonderful resources on our website that includes these talks from both last year and the ones that have happened this year are up already. And we'll be posting this one in the coming weeks, and the other ones in the series. So a little nudge for those of you who are new to the lab and don't know about our work, please feel free to check out the website and keep up to date on events. There'll be one more lecture as part of the series this year. So please head to the website and check that out. And we'd love to have you join us for that and to spread the word. So welcome, everyone. And I'm going to introduce Jennifer Llewellyn, who's the director of the lab, who will let you know a bit about Donna. Thank you.
Hi, well, good evening, everyone. I am losing my voice, so I apologize for that. I'm not trying to do, I was going to date myself and say a Marge Simpson impression, but I feel like we might all get that, at least who are in the room. It's my distinct pleasure to be here tonight and to have a chance to have some folks both within the room and online as part of this community that we've been building of fellows and associates at the lab. The fellows and associates are a community of both scholars and practitioners who are connected to the lab because they're involved in some aspects of our work, our projects, and you can learn a bit more about them and about those projects on the website. And we've been meeting each year. We meet for the first half of the year together to share conversation about our interest and our knowledge and a restorative approach, and about the various pieces of work that we're engaged in and research that we're doing. And then in the latter half, some of our community, the brave souls in our community, step up and say that they're willing to present that work and to share that with our broader community here in Nova Scotia, who's affiliated and connected with the lab, and certainly across Canada and internationally, given some of the names and friends I can see who've joined us online. So tonight, it's our great pleasure to introduce to you and to welcome Professor Donna Coker, who has been the international, as Catherine said, the International Visiting Fellow this year at the lab. Professor Coker is a professor at the University of Miami, where she teaches evidence, criminal law, gender and violence and social justice, restorative justice in the lab, and a course called Mass Incarceration, Causes, Consequences, and Remedies, which I really want to take, and criminal justice policy reform. She's received the Provost Research Award at her university in 2017 and 2021, and she's been awarded the Teaching Award at her university as well. Professor Coker's scholarship focuses on criminal law, gender, and race inequality. She's a nationally recognized expert in intimate partner violence, IPV, law and policy. She's a leading critic of the disproportionate focus on criminal justice responses that characterizes US IVP policy, and I think we'll learn a bit about that tonight. Her widely cited research illustrates the negative impacts of this focus on women marginalized as a function of poverty, race, and immigration status. She's the author of numerous highly regarded articles on restorative justice responses to gender violence. Her research regarding the use of restorative justice approaches in IPV and sexual harm has influenced work in interdisciplinary fields connected to restorative justice and domestic violence in the United States and abroad. Her empirical study of domestic violence cases in Navajo Peacemaking Courts was one of the first empirical studies of peacemaking and the first to focus on domestic violence cases. And her recent scholarship examines the use of restorative justice responses to campus sexual assault. She is the co-founder of the Reimagining Project, which highlights the thinking of leading scholars and activists involved in changing the response to gender violence. She's assisted numerous nonprofit and advocacy organizations. She served as an expert and advisor to the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women, an advisory board. It was an advisory board member for a national portrait of the restorative approaches to intimate partner violence, which was a national survey. She's a founding board member of the nonprofit Media for Change. She's currently working with the organization Beyond the Bars. Before attending law school, Professor Coker worked in the domestic violence field for 10 years. This work began in 1978 when she was just a baby. When she became the sole staff person for a newly opened battered women's shelter in Little Rock, Arkansas. In subsequent years, she was the coordinator of a community-based battered women's project in Honolulu, Hawaii, overseeing advocacy and support for more than 100 women a year. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you here tonight and to share your wisdom and your thoughts with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jennifer. And thank you to everybody associated with the lab. It's really wonderful to be here. A bit of a shock in the weather, even though I had read about it, but you don't know until you know, right? To be here in Halifax, but I've had a very warm welcome and I'm very grateful to be here. As Jennifer just noted, I started work doing domestic violence work back in 1978 as a baby, as a social worker, undergraduate doing a practicum in a shelter. I was the only staff person in the shelter. It's a little bit nuts. I probably shouldn't have been doing that. But my work with regard to restorative justice began quite a number of years later, and that began after I had graduated from law school and I had an opportunity to meet the former Justice Ray Austin of the Navajo Nation Supreme Court. And Justice Austin was teaching a course in peacemaking and in Native American law, as they called it. And I was a lecturer at the same law school, and I was teaching a course in domestic violence. And we had some of the same students, and those students started talking to me about what he was saying about peacemaking. So that's how we met. I subsequently then had the opportunity to do the research that Jennifer was just talking about. Looking at peacemaking, and that became really a focus of my work going forward. I was interested in peacemaking because I was concerned that our focus had become incredibly crime-centered. I knew from my experience that many survivors certainly wanted the violence to stop, but they really were not looking for punishment. What they wanted was assistance. I knew that for many, they understood that histories of trauma and also sometimes drug addiction and alcohol addiction, as well as economic stress, as well as other systems of oppression, had everything to do everything to do with what was going on in their relationship. And so they didn't find reaching out to the criminal justice system, one of the most violent systems in our culture and in our country, to be the thing that they wanted to do. So I became really interested in trying to think about alternatives here. I'm going to try to uncrowd my podium here a bit. So today what I want to do is just give you some observations from the work that I've been doing now on domestic violence. And with regard, much of what I'm going to talk about is really about intimate partner violence, but I'm going to talk a little bit about sexual assault as well. My work on sexual assault has been in the campus context, so that's the context I understand best, though obviously there's some overlap there as well. So when we think about, what did I do wrong? Wrong one. All right. So if I had made this slide, but I'm not clever enough to make a slide like this, I probably would have named these a little bit different, but I thought this was a helpful slide in thinking about the sort of continuum of practices that we think about in restorative justice. And I'm going to talk, using this as my model, I'm going to talk about 2 points on this continuum, and then I'll tell you why it's problematic to talk about processes. But first, let me say this. I'm going to talk about what's listed here as targeted interventions. So I'm going to refer to those as responses to harm that has occurred. And then I'm going to talk about community building. And I'm going to talk about that as a really, I think, important and less understood, perhaps at least in the academic spaces, as part of how we should be thinking about restorative justice and domestic violence and sexual harm. So why did I say that I thought, now I'm going to tell you why I thought this was problematic. So I think that a focus on processes is not the best way to think about this. I think that it's useful in some ways. It helps us to think about, different systems. And I'm going to talk a lot tonight about systems. But I really think that most of us think that restorative justice is an approach, and that you use the processes that best work. You're not necessarily doing sentencing, family group conferencing, et cetera. You're using the processes that best work, and that restorative, and that you try to be restorative all the way down, right? From the get-go, in every encounter, in every part of the work. A lot of the literature, I think, focuses on dialogue, and focuses particularly on what I've called match dialogue, a dialogue that involves the responsible person and the harmed person. But I think that as I grow in this work, I better understand all of the other ways in which restorative justice happens. So I'm going to be thinking about it in that way. So maybe, right. So thinking about restorative justice, first, as I said, as a response to harm, and then I'll talk about the community. Specific wrongs or wrongful acts or existing states of injustice. I think this is one of Jennifer's definitions that captures, I think, quite a lot there, because I think much of the literature doesn't talk about existing states of injustice. So when we think about restorative justice in the context of intimate partner violence, then what kind of wrongful acts and existing states of injustice are we talking about? This one is a little bit out of order. This is it's a journey rather than a point in time. I like the road emblem there. All right. So, whoops. So what are we talking about? Well, obviously, what are the harms, right? What are the harms? I think that we think obviously about physical injury. That's certainly a harm. We think about psychological injury, a very, very significant harm. In fact, quite a lot of the research shows that survivors describe that as actually more damaging in many ways than the physical injury. We also think about economic harm. Intimate partner violence is and it deepens women's poverty. It's a major source of homelessness. In fact, some studies find that 1 in 4 homeless women in the US are there because of domestic violence. If you think a little more broadly and you start asking how many have experienced violence, of course, you get even much higher numbers. But I think that we need to understand too that, of course, that homelessness not only is caused by violence, but that being homeless, being unhoused makes one more vulnerable to violence. You have this kind of circular kind of effect. And of course, we know that abusive partners can engage in economic abuse. We know that there's a great deal of literature about forcing women to, or forcing or coercing women into signing instruments that create tremendous debt, et cetera, et cetera. But I think I'm going to suggest that the harms are beyond those harms that we most often think about. And that is to think about harms in a more kind of structural kind of way. So we know, for example, this is where this goes. We know, for example, that poor women are more vulnerable to violence. We know that that's not unusual. I mean, all of the research on violence shows that poverty, the experience of poverty is linked to both victimization and linked to perpetration of violence. And that is also true in the intimate partner violence space, though it has, for many, many years, it's not something that people, that the movement, if you will, wanted to highlight. And I think it's really important to highlight that. We also might want to think about the harms to others as well, obviously to children, to family members, to the networks, but also harms to the person who's responsible for committing violence. I'm going to say that again, also harms for the person who's responsible for committing violence, right? Who often feel deep feelings of shame, humiliation, who are themselves often victims of violence, because there's a very common intergenerational aspect to intimate partner violence. And in the US, at least, who are very unlikely to find accessible forms of help without going through some sort of state system. So I'm happy to say that New York City recently funded 3 different programs. They have a program called Respect and Responsibility. And this program is a free service, self-referred kind of service, but that is very unusual in my country. Most of the programs you have to get convicted, you have to plead out, or you have to be referred, and you have to pay, when you are referred. I'll talk about that in a minute. So, and then I think when we think about violence, when we think about the harms of state violence. So in 2015, I was the lead researcher on a study of a survey of service providers in the US. We had more than 900 respondents. It probably helped that I was working with my colleague, Carrie Bettinger-Lopez, who was then a liaison in the White House, and there was and we were going to have a meeting with Biden, so who was vice president. So that, I'm not sure we would have gotten that 900 otherwise. But these were service providers from all over the country. We asked them about sexual assault and domestic violence and policing. And what we found was very significant bias on the police force. Our respondents reported high rates of violence along a number of different measures, including race, including LGBTQ in terms of immigration status, I shouldn't say status, just being an immigrant, because it really wasn't about status per se. And bias against women they perceived as drug users, women they perceived as sex workers, and bias against poor people. All of this showed up in the survey. We found also evidence of a general bias just about people who claimed to be the victims of domestic violence or sexual assault. The National Hotline for Domestic Violence did a survey at about the same time, actually prompted by our survey, because ours, of course, was a secondary reports. And what they found is that significant numbers of those who called who reported that they had talked to the police said that they would not call again. Their experiences had been so negative that they wouldn't call again. And others reported that they had no interest in calling the police at all. There's also an aspect in which in the lives, particularly in the lives of poor women and men, there's a structural inequality aspect that is, that I'm going to borrow a term from Dorothy Roberts, a system intersectionality. So most of us, we talk about intersectionality in terms of the particular status, vulnerabilities of people according to an axis of race and gender and perhaps class, though not as frequently about class as I'd like. But what Dorothy means when she's talking about system intersectionality is she's talking about the ways in which bias travels from one system to another system to another system and informs the system. So in Dorothy's context, she's talking about how the production of stereotypes of Black single mothers as inadequate, as criminal, as incapable, travel so that it affects the juvenile justice system. That explains why it is that you get more Black children placed in placement treatments rather than allowed to be placed with their parents. It's because of that bias. That bias then also travels, of course, in the child welfare system, right? Exactly. And travels in the treatment of women who are in prison and their ability to see their children. It is a bias that travels and gets reinforced in every kind of system encounter. That's very much true for a number of the survivors who are experiencing domestic violence, right? Who are experiencing multiple systems of oppression and who are suffering from or experiencing rather this system kind of intersectionality, whether it's with the child welfare system, perhaps the juvenile system, perhaps the criminal system. If you have a criminal record, by the way, then in addition to everything I've just described, you are likely to be, you may be on parole or probation where an encounter with police and law enforcement brings particular risk, and you're very unlikely to be able to get work. All right. So I think that some of the literature we think about, somebody has to be admitted. I am distracted. So in the literature, we think sometimes that you can distinguish between, if you will, the justice needs of a survivor and the material needs. I don't think you can. I think that the systems I've described for you, the setting I've described for you, permeates, it's interwoven, it is part of the violence experience, it is part of the harm, it cannot be parceled out. And so I think that is a real challenge for us who are doing restorative justice work to think about how we address a myriad of harms that are not just simply about who hit who or whom. I'm not sure. All right, so when you think about, so I'm gonna keep on this systems for a little bit. Sorry. I'm terrible at keeping up with my slides. So I think I want to think about the restorative justice processes in terms of formal systems, some of which I've already mentioned, and informal systems of family, community, religious organizations and communities, and other kinds of communities. And I'm gonna suggest that we have spent some time, not nearly enough time, perhaps, thinking about how we interact with the informal systems, right? Maybe not enough, right? Thinking about the relationships, thinking about how important networks are, how important peer networks are to the maintenance of violence, thinking about the intergenerational nature of violence, and thinking about how either in conferencing or circle practice with families, we can think about all of those informal systems in the way that they inform violence, and thinking about how to create more resources, more services, more support from those networks in interrupting the violence that's been happening. And so I think about that a lot. And I know some of you think about that as well. I think then we also have to think about the formal systems, right? As well as the informal systems. And I'm going to suggest that we think about the ways in which restorative justice programs and processes are embedded or not embedded in those systems. There we go. So one way of thinking about this is whether programs are system integrated, and by that, it's just a term. If you have a better term, tell me, because I don't love it, but it's what I have right now. What I mean by that is whether the outcome by design has an effect on the decision-making of a governing formal system, criminal system, child welfare system, for example, school system, for example. System affiliated, I'm thinking about processes that are affiliated with the formal system, but by design, the outcome doesn't have an effect. So that's true for some of the in custody kinds of programs, right? Right. And then I'm thinking about community-based, but in Canada, I've been told not to use that term because it has a totally different meaning. So I'm saying independent for programs that are neither integrated nor affiliated, right? So I think when we're thinking about system integrated kinds of processes by design, then we hope that we are transforming those systems. We hope we're doing something ameliorative at least, right? But we hope that we're transforming those systems in some way, right? And when we're thinking about community-based, we are responding in part, I think, to the dangers, the risk of those formal systems. And we are, of course, in both cases, hoping to address informal systems change as well. I think if we bring a relational lens, a restorative relational lens, then to this work, we have to think that in our work of transformation can work both ways, right? That systems to which restorative processes are integrated or affiliated may be changed. Restorative justice is also likely to be changed. That transformation occurs across and between. And that so that we are changing systems while being changed by systems, even while we struggle perhaps to replace systems. I think this quote from the recent book, Abolition, Feminism Now, rather captures that kind of disjuncture, that kind of struggle. Abolition feminism doesn't shy away from contradictions. Campaigns to close jails and prisons can move forward as we continue to teach classes and as we support restorative justice proceedings. Changing systems, being changed by systems while we struggle to replace systems. So I'm going to talk now about some examples of some programs in the US. And as I'm not sure I did note this before. My notes say I did, but I don't think I did. That many states in the US have laws that prohibit referrals, criminal justice referrals to restorative justice in cases of intimate partner violence or domestic violence. But that's not true for every state. So I think that probably the most well-established in the US, and it wouldn't surprise me if it's not the most well-established here in this space, would be family group decision-making. Joan Pennell notes that the kind of opposition that restorative justice criminal diversion met with was not true in her experience for family group decision-making, which of course works in the child welfare kind of context. So Joan describes in her book, Restorative Approach to Family Violence, Feminist Kin-Making, she describes kin-making as a process of building kin between cultural networks, family and cultural networks, and outside groups, meaning government institutions, as well as other kinds of outside work, so formal systems, informal systems, to weave together, to craft a new sort of making of kinship. In my research and looking at peacemaking, which I won a flag was quite some years ago. So I tell you what I knew then, but not what I know now when I say this. One of the things that really struck me was the way in which the peacemakers understood themselves to be creating this kind of kinship. It's not that they thought it existed. They saw the peacemaking as an opportunity to sort of rebuild, to create, to knit together relationships that were terribly fractured by obviously by long history of settler colonization, et cetera. The other thing that I think is important in Joan's work, and that shows up in family group decision making. It certainly shows up here in the M.S.W Family and Children's Services in Nova Scotia's family group decision making program. Is a focus on culture, is a focus on rebuilding, reestablishing culture, and focus on storytelling, a focus on ceremonies, and a focus on seeing culture and family not as lacking, but rather as having the resources to be useful in a sort of, as Penhold calls it, feminist kin making, in changing those connections. One of the things about it's just a little note about language. Kristen Bask, who's the manager of prevention services at M.S.W Family and Children's Services, notes that conferencing was an off-putting word. And so they started saying we're doing circles. That was a culturally appropriate word. Mimi Kim, we're going to talk about chat in a moment, in a program in the US, discovered that when they used the term restorative justice, that restorative justice did not work well at all with their Latinx, particularly their Latinx members who affiliated justice with the criminal justice system. And so they started using circles as well. In addition, the other way in which restorative justice has been a system integrated approach has been as a domestic violence intervention program. The more common terminology in the US is a BIP, a batterers intervention program. But for perhaps obvious reasons, I would prefer, and many of us have made that change, to call it a domestic violence intervention program because of the kind of naming aspect of having a batterers intervention program, is that, and so that's who you are forever, as though you are what you did. And I just want to mention a couple of things here. So I think that it's important to understand in the US context that the development of these restorative batterers intervention programs, I just did it, domestic violence intervention programs, old habits, is that they are in part a response to some of the criticisms of the standard programs. And those standard programs have focused very much the criticism is that they focus very much on responsibility without context. That they have, as Deborah Wiseman knows, they treat individuals, they don't treat systems. They also bring a certain, what I've called elsewhere, crime logic kind of understanding. And what I mean by that is a complete disavowal of any sort of social determinant of behavior aspect to violence. And so by example, the North Carolina Domestic Violence Intervention Program will not take insurance reimbursement. And this is true for a bunch of the programs. And their language is because domestic violence is a mental health, not a mental health diagnosis, but a behavior choice. So when we understand the ways in which economic stress is related to domestic violence, this seems like a particularly poor choice on their part. So what the programs do, and I'll just mention circles of peace here. is to incorporate restorative practices within their domestic violence intervention program. The survivor may or may not be in the dialogue. That's completely up to his or her, or they to choose. But they do address intergenerational harms in the same way that happens in family group decision-making kind of process. There's an opportunity for family members to talk about, to uncover histories of violence, and an opportunity to take responsibility in that sort of more structural kind of context. In the interest of time, I'm looking at the time. I'm not going to talk about, I'm not going to spend time talking about campus programs, but there are some campus programs that have developed as well. And if that's something anybody wants me to talk about, I'll do that. I'm going to skip then to, there's the campus. I'm going to skip to community, to the community base. And again, we're still talking about responses to harm. And just highlight one. CHAT is which stands for Collective Healing and Transformation. It's a California project. Some of you probably know that Mimi Kim and Sujata Balaga are both involved in that program. And it was created by a broad group of community organizations, social justice organizations, as well as service organizations. Has no law enforcement at all. No law enforcement involved. No, it's not based on law enforcement kinds of referrals. And I think that the quote I put here is very interesting and informative. And something of a challenge, I think, to the way in which a lot of restorative justice is organized. A lot of our thinking is organized. So I won't read all of these slides, but this one I'll read. Few of the cases took a simple form of intimate partner violence, that is, a sole pattern of violence by one partner against another within a nuclear family. Instead, the cases took the shape, oh, there's a spelling error there. It took the shape of families in Costa County, that is, families facing in many circumstances poverty and the lack of other resources. And then she goes on to talk about multi-generational households, histories of trauma from home countries and migration. So what's interesting here to me is that when we invited, she got in the summary of chat, when we invited other people beyond the survivor to share their perspectives, we see the shifting patterns of family violence that might mark one person as a victim and a perpetrator of violence. When we asked them what their goals were, the results were often better communication, understanding, the ability to live together in peace. So I'm going to just talk about this. So I've already mentioned Navajo peacemaking. There are more than 30 Native American tribal codes that have peacemaking enabling legislation. And so along with family group conferencing, the revival, I'm not talking about long history, but the revival of peacemaking, the indigenizing of law and culture has been very much a part of this revival of peacemaking. Two things I would note. One is that while there are 30 tribal codes, they differ dramatically in their approach to whether domestic violence or sexual harm should be seen in those cases. The Navajo Nation has included those cases from the beginning. They take, and peacemaking takes referrals both from formal systems within the Navajo Nation, child welfare, criminal justice, juvenile, but also has self-referrals, is open to anyone who wants to claim that there's a harm. All right. How am I doing? When did I start? Am I running late? Okay, sure. All right. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. Okay. So I think there's some critical elements. These are just some of these are well discussed in the literature. So I'll just highlight some of those that I think are not. That is the importance of asking open-ended questions that you see from chat. The importance of culture, the importance of intervention in informal systems, informed by those larger systems of oppression, and recognizing the location of the program, recognizing the system with which the program is integrated, and the impact of that system on the thinking that's occurring within the program. So I think in terms of equitable design, I think because of time, I'm gonna come back to this, but I'll let you talk about it. I'll let you tell me if you want to hear more about that. So, and then because I want some time to talk about these community-based. So you remember back at the very beginning slide, back on kind of community building. So the Soul Sisters Leadership Collective, which is here, but unfortunately closed at the end of 2022, is an example of the kind of programming that's happening in a number of places that it tends to be focused on youth. Here it was focused on particularly youth of color. Here it was focused on Black and brown girls and femme-identified and trans and gender non-conforming youth. But took both this kind of social emotional learning kind of aspect, right? In a lot of circle kind of practice and proactive circle practice from the school system way of thinking about it. But then also provided opportunities for the girls to be, in girls and femme-identified, the youth, to be involved in social justice change. So it was not just a leadership development, but it was a leadership development that connected their own experience with other kinds of change. The National Compadres network here is focused on boys and men of color. And this is a quote from the director here. "We boys and men of color get criminalized early on in our schooling as marginalized men that manifests itself later in our relationships in our communities. In this patriarchal and racist society, we all need healing, rebalancing, rites of passage, support, and decolonization." The Talia Gonzalez and Rebecca Epstein with the Georgetown Poverty and Inequality Center looked at the impact of proactive restorative justice circles in school systems, finding that that kind of practice was particularly meaningful for girls of color, giving opportunities for both empowerment and giving opportunities for voice, giving opportunities to deal with the kind of racialized sexism that the girls were facing in the school system. I'm going to suggest that this is part of our gender violence work. All right, how many minutes, Jake? I'm good. Okay, cool. I'm going to blur through this. No, it's fine. I want to turn then from focus on harm and community building, and I want to telescope back another level. And I want to do that to explain why it is that restorative justice is receiving so much attention in the US right now, in ways that just has not been true in my view. And particularly receiving attention from progressives and from movement people. And that's new, I think, relatively new. So there's been a long history of opposition to the use of restorative justice in response to gender violence, in response to sexual harms and intimate partner violence. Some very good reasons having to do with capacity and expertise. I'm going to suggest that for the most part, the programs that we've come a long way. Those programs now really do bring that kind of expertise. They do have that kind of capacity. But I think some of that opposition was ideological. It wasn't about capacity and expertise. And I'm going to suggest that some of that was the function of what I've called crime logic, just a logic that is endemic in the criminal system, but that really pervades so much of the way we think about harm. And I've highlighted here the one that I've given the most attention to tonight. I'm also going to suggest that a lot of the ways in which we, including me, thought about violence really promoted this kind of crime logic, that we thought about it in terms of choice, in just the way you heard me describe the North Carolina's domestic violence intervention program, and that this power and control wheel, which may not be familiar to everyone here, was developed by the Duluth Abuse Intervention Project in Minnesota, was incredibly instrumental, had incredible power. Many state governments right now, many of the laws in the states require that any sort of referral to a domestic violence intervention program incorporate this kind of psychoeducational learning that really is focused on power and control. What's missing here, and it was not missing so much in the training I received from the Duluth way back when, where the Ellen Pence and Michael Paymar talked about larger systems of control. But as power and control traveled, that fell out. And the focus really became this kind of really simplistic, rational actor who chooses to do violence. All right. So the larger context there then, the change in feminist thinking, I want to scope back just a minute because the opposition began to change in the 2010s, and I want to think about why. So part of that were years of activism by organizations like Insight, and I'm going to suggest also the influence of the transformative justice movement. So transformative justice work largely came out of Insight. I mean, these are all the same people, right? Mimi Kim was one of the founders of Insight and one of the founders of Creative Interventions, which has become one of the most influential transformative justice programs. And by transformative justice, I'm talking about work that initially came out of movement space that grew from prison abolition work and was first really used in movement kinds of organizations as a way to address harm without involving the state. It has certainly traveled since then. And so the Creative Interventions Toolkit that Mimi Kim was instrumental in putting together is intended to assist any community organization, regardless of where one is on the political spectrum, in addressing harm that occurs without involvement in the state. But the other reason that I think that this change has happened has to be the incredible strength and behemoth of mass incarceration in the US and the growing recognition across the board, across political perspectives. So talk about backlash at the end in the US. So I don't know if Jennifer remembers when I showed this to the Domestic Violence Canada Domestic Violence Conference in 2020, there was this big room and there was this audible gasp, right, across the room at this incredible number. This is per 100,000, right? So the US right now holds almost 2 million. It has dipped almost 2 million people. We have about 1,600 state prisons, 98 federal prisons, 3,000 local jails, about 1,300 juvenile correctional facilities, 181 immigration detention facilities, 80 Indian country. Indian country yeah, I'll tell you later. Indian country represents a portion of the U.S. that is in which there are several tribal nations, not the only, right? Okay. As well as in military prisons, civil commitment centers, state psychiatric hospitals, and prisons in U.S. territories. The largest number of people are in state prisons by far, followed by jails, followed by federal prisons. We've got like 34,000 roughly people in immigration detention. What'd you say? That I just want to call your attention to the jail system for a moment. Because in the jail system, 80% of those who are in jail are there because they're waiting trial, and the vast majority of those are there because they can't pay bail. All right. The racial disparity, I suspect, is well known by everyone here, but it bears repeating that African Americans, Blacks are far greatly overrepresented in the U.S. system, as are Latinx, as are white, and not on this chart, but the same is true, but more so in the federal system for American Indian and Alaska Natives, and that has to do with jurisdiction on felony crimes. So restorative justice has become sort of the go-to. It's on the list for all the progressive kinds of reforms that are about reforming bail, about supporting community-based violence interventions, about creating trauma centers, about shifts to mental health experts instead of expecting law enforcement to be mental health experts, et cetera. I'm going to flip through these and I'll come back. So that's some data, comparative data. You see the same kind, you see racial disparities here, though your numbers incarcerated are far, far, far lower. As per 100,000 people, far, far lower. So the impact of mass incarceration then has been to create, it's just simply not captured by the number of people who are sitting in prison. It's to create a whole group of people who are practically unemployable. And it is to remove from neighborhoods because of the hyper-incarceration focus, as Loic Wykant describes. The hyper-incarceration means that we're talking about particular neighborhoods. It's to remove people who are at their prime wage earning years. So it has devastating impacts economically, socially, on not just the individual, not just the family, but also entire neighborhoods and indeed on the whole nation. As one researcher said, we've been involved in a grand, unregulated experiment. So the feminist change then, I think, is certainly captured by this statement. This was signed by 45 state domestic violence, sexual assault coalitions. And the coalitions, their memberships are all of the service providers in that state. Now, it wasn't 45 states because a lot of states have both a domestic violence and a sexual assault coalition. The Florida sexual assault signed on, the domestic violence coalition, no way. They're getting tons and tons of money from the right-wing Florida legislature. So don't be misled. But 45 is still a number, quite a substantial number. And it's certainly, I should put that before that, certainly very much influenced by the organizing work of Black Lives Matter, or the movement for Black Lives. So It's also seen, this change is also seen in the most recent federal violence against women legislation, which includes some funding for restorative justice. And the fight about that legislation is really informative. So earlier renditions suggested that maybe it would be diversion from criminal prosecution. There was a tremendous kind of political backlash. What happened was then a guy named Casey Quinn, who runs one of the domestic violence centers, which houses prosecutors as well as other kind of service providers. And along with some other domestic violence organizations, lobbied very, very hard to try to get rid of it. What ended up happening is a strange piece of legislation, indeed. What it does is it says you can use money to develop a restorative justice program as long as it has no affiliation with the criminal system or the civil protection order system, and nobody involved has a pending case against them in either of those systems. So we have federal funds to create a community-based restorative justice program, not where I thought we'd end up. So here's Casey writing, who's crowing about the result. Prosecutors will get to continue to make all the decisions. No community group's going to tell us what to do, right? And the result was what I just described. All right, so where are we? Well, I can't leave it. I can't leave it on this happy note, right? Because you would say, what rock are you living under? You live in the state of Florida, after all. So we're under attack. By we, I mean liberal democracy is under attack. All progressive kinds of responses are under attack. Some of the restorative justice programs in school systems, I'm told, this is from Talia Gonzalez, who follows these things. Some of those are in more shift are also closing down, or people are sort of trying to stay under the radar kind of screen. This in the horrific shooting that happened at the Parkland school, you may know that this grieving father blamed restorative justice for the fact that that his daughter was killed, and that's carried some political water. But probably more so are the attacks on quote critical race theory. I say quote because it's not with because there's no relationship between the language in the bill and anything that was actually happening in a classroom. But the ideological attacks on critical race theory, the ideological attacks on the Don't Say Gay bill, and then the most recent Florida legislation, which is still, didn't check this morning, but still held up in court. And that's the so-called anti-woke bill, which would make it so that no public school can talk really about, I don't know, social emotional learning, right? Can talk about anything that might suggest any sort of reflection or any sort of teaching about racial injustice. This is where we are now. So, on that happy note, well, I mean, I think the thing I'm supposed to say now is this: there's no more important time for this work that we do. We certainly have seen some movement. There's been a number of restorative justice initiatives that I would not have thought would ever happen coming out of domestic violence service providers. And we have this kind of national and state politics that are right. And of course, I didn't even mention Dobbs' decision, which is the abortion decision. All right. So thank you, and thank you for your patience. I talked too long. I'm going to stay here. Okay. Okay.
So I'm gonna walk here only so I can speak in the mic and give
Okay.
instructions.
Okay.
No, stand.
All right.
I'm just gonna give instructions to the people who are online, and I think Jacob has also typed this in the chat, which is we're happy to take any questions from folks online. You can type them out and Jacob will ask them. And then we're happy to start with those in the room if there are things that Donna said that she passed over you want to know more about, if there are questions you have about some of the history that she's charted, some of the moment that we're in, just as we were seeing a kind of a change and a really significant and important change that we are in this moment of significant backlash, or if you want to ask her about some of her work. So I'll open that floor. I'll let you manage your asking in the room,
Okay.
and then we'll ask you.
Okay,
online.
great. Questions, comments?
I was hoping to say a teeny bit more about some of the internal dynamics that you think might have been at work in terms of the women's movement, about the role of crime logic and the sort of victory that was won around the public significance of domestic violence and pro-prosecution, and the kind of maybe it's pure victory, but the dynamics that were created by that in terms of letting that go.
I'm sure. Yes, I can. I mean, I think that so first I want to say this. So that it's not as though no one was raising an alarm when the kind of focus on criminal justice interventions occurred. And I think that's really important, and I'd rather breezed by that. This is not a monolithic story. This is it was a complicated political story then too, and it has remained so. So I think Beth Ritchie does a good job of describing particularly the ways in which some, certainly not all, but some women of color raised concerns about it. Then I think that some of the work that Rose Corrigan does in looking at the anti-rape movement does a similar kind of thing, showing the ways in which particularly women on the left raised real concerns about the kind of move. And in fact, there's an interesting story and some similarities between what Rose says about anti-rape movement and Mamie Kim's work on carceral creep. In that, in the anti-rape movement, even those who supported criminal kinds of remedies, they were sort of persuaded to do so. Eventually, some of them, because of the kind of symbolic kind of representation that this was a serious thing, it was a crime, and that was important. That was more important than unlike sort of what happened in the domestic violence movement, more important than actual kind of heavy prosecution. In fact, many of them also supported lesser penalties. They wanted enforcement and they wanted lesser penalties because the idea was that actually rape is a pretty common thing, and that again, normal, not psychiatrically problem men rape, and so we want lesser penalties. That means that juries are more likely to convict, and this kind of thing. Mamie describes I'm sorry, I shouldn't leave that story hanging. So what happened is that the more conservative forces in the legislature were really very, very happy to have that support, and turned the legislation in a much more punitive direction, in fairness, than what the feminists who were pro the legislation were arguing. So, right. I mean, when we get to the Violence Against Women Act in 1994, then we get the registries, right? That comes out of that act. If states want to get money, then they need to have sex offender registries, and that's how sex offender registries get in every state. So on the in the domestic violence movement, and I think Mimi does a great job of describing this. Sort of in the domestic violence movement, then you have sort of this idea that you could embed, my term, in prosecutors' offices. So you have victim witness counselors, feminists who fill these roles as victim witness counselors, create the position or push for the position, fill those kind of roles. And for some anyway, it was a way to blunt the harms of mandatory arrests and pro-prosecution, which after all were designed to control the state. They were designed to control the police and what they did, not to control victims. And so they were to intervene that way. And Mimi describes the ways in which that turned into then really a collaboration that became a co-optation. That the power of the criminal system was far more powerful. And I think, most of the folks doing victim witness assistance now would not describe their work in the way in which some of those early feminists would describe them. I should mention too another couple of other important writers here. Aya Gruber's book on the feminist war on crime looks at the rape movement as well, and does a great job. And of course, many of you know Lee Goodmark's work on this as well. Yeah.
So where would you see the best energy for work? Like in the past, remote impact.
Oh, okay. All right. So thinking about the system integrated, system affiliated, and community based. I would say not system affiliated. I think system affiliated does great work. But I think that if what you want to do is to the two things that I want to do, right? You want to diminish the footprint of the criminal system. You want to move towards, in my view, I want to move towards prison abolition. I want to think about, and by prison abolition, I should say what I mean. What I see that as a journey. I see that as diminishing the footprint of the criminal system, diminishing, right, and reallocating both to the community and to other kinds of like health provision, public health kinds of measures and stuff like that. That's not what everybody needs. That's what I mean. But if you want to do that, then I think that that those are the two places to do work. So in the community, I mean, what's happening right now is that in many parts of the country, even with no drop prosecution, blah, 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 many cases are getting dropped. It's all, and the numbers are a bit of a game. So it's all about whether whether you have some sort of system where you review the cases, it's the point at which the prosecution reviews the cases that can tell you, that gives you the number about how many are getting null pros and how many are going forward. So many cases are dropped. And so what you have is a terrible situation in which you have an arrest, which has a horrible consequences for people, connects to all the problems that I showed you, right? And then you just get paid, just stacks of papers get moved around, and hopefully, I mean, in the best systems, the survivor gets connected to some services, obviously, I should say. So I can't help, I guess I'm not willing to not want to move forward with, even if I think it's ameliorative, with work that's system integrated. But I have a lot of, but my heart is in a lot of the community work, a lot of the community-based work. I think that the ways in which organizations that do violence interruption have migrated or have included within their scope, not just, they originated with gang violence, now they include in their scope domestic violence. I think that the ways in which trauma-informed centers are trying to intervene to prevent the kind of ways in which, to be a bit glib, but it's still so powerful, hurt people. I think that's really exciting work. Is that a dodge? Did that help? It's impossible. I mean, it's impossible. I think that there's a real, there's a real concern when you start, and you should be concerned when you start working with prosecutors and around restorative justice, and it's such a huge travel from this, what they mostly know, which is juvenile and low level. Now you're going to go here. And they immediately think of, all of those cases, all those cases that shouldn't be brought in the first place, right? This gives me something to do, and I can, to the most positive glosses, and I can help people. I think that's true. I think, I can use the power of the state and I can help this person have a better outcome because I'll just put, and so, and maybe this is, I should go back to the equitable design slide, because I think that, we have a system where the referrals are coming from the court and they're coming from the prosecutor if it's in the crim system. And very often you're not getting, you may not be getting data that even allows the restorative justice program, the private program that's got a contract, right, to know what kinds of factors are going into the referrals. And so, at a baseline, I think you have to have that. You can't, hopefully you negotiate with the prosecutor for a set of rationales, but for referral, but you can't know if implicit bias, racial bias is working if you can't see the data, right? And so I think that's a critical kind of thing. So I just went all over the place. I don't know. Yeah.
There on victims. Like you talked about what we'd like to hear, and we see that, sometimes women say, we want to stay together, we want help.
Right.
In the beginning, when our moratorium was put in place, there was what I would call some core research that really sort of devalued restorative justice here and made us sad. I remember one chapter that said, in community church basements, these people will handle, and I guess what I'm thinking, I'm going to go around too, but I'm thinking of this shift where women's and victims advocates fought so long to get out of the private sphere into the courts and thought that was a win, but it's not working, and yet there's such a reluctance. So in fact, I've been working with energy. We've got this program that is very well situated. Where does the energy go, and how do victims' voices get heard? How do they understand what we do so that they can have a say?
Yeah, so it's going to sound like another dodge, but I think that is so. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, so the question is that so in this context here in Nova Scotia, there's a moratorium, which means on referrals from the criminal system. I think that's the accurate way to describe it. And that came into place because of some opposition organized by feminist opposition quite some years ago, a long time ago. And that is characterized here as not being particularly sound in terms of research and completely mischaracterized restorative justice. And I have to say, from what I've read, that seems my sense as well, but I wasn't here. I'm not, not here. So I think that I think, well, number one, my sense is that you've traveled a long way since then. That there really is a considerably more kind of support and feminist support. That's certainly my sense from a number of people I've talked to. So I think that, should acknowledge that. I think that's key. And then, and this is the dodge part, everything is context. It's all about where the lever is here. And don't know that, right? Where are the openings? Where's the place to make a difference? But from what I've seen, you seem to be moving that way. I think that, so one of the interesting things, let me just mention this, is the New York City Mayor's Office on domestic violence had created a domestic violence restorative justice, I'm probably getting this wrong, blueprint. It was sort of really a way of thinking about what restorative justice looks like and might look like in this context. The Center for CCI, Center for Court Innovation. Thank you. Erica Sasson and some other people have been very much involved and she was there then in doing that kind of thinking. The Obama administration supported some roundtables that gave people an opportunity to meet and sort of have discussions, among sort of key leaders in various different communities around restorative justice. So there have been, that kind of movement. What's happened in New York, I think, is instructive in that. So they have the blueprint. I've already told you about the new free programs, desistance programs. But then what kind of followed from that blueprint was there are some organizations that were already wanting to do RJ or already did, and they're doing community-based and they're doing what they do, or transformative and they're doing what they do. But a collaborative was formed, got some money to just sponsor this ongoing kind of conversation so that staff members actually got paid when they went to these meetings instead of just having it be one more, work you did for free. And out of that has developed, for example, the development in BIP, Victim Intervention Project, which is a program in New York. That's the oldest program serving Latinx survivors. They've been meeting with a restorative justice practitioner and trainer, and they are now starting to build a restorative justice program. That I think is what's happening. This, it's a move that doesn't engage directly in the fight about criminal referrals. It's about developing capacities in communities. Yeah. Okay.
Joan Pennell would like to know what you're learning about a restorative approach in Canada that you'll bring back to the United States.
Oh, Joan. I know. Oh, okay. And for those of you who don't know, Joan and Gail Burford's work on family group decision-making originated here. And then, Joan took it to North Carolina and many other places, Gail as well, much to our benefit. I wish I weren't being recorded. So it's because I'm going to say some things that are probably just totally wrong, right? So I'm really, I sat in a meeting recently with several folks affiliated with the lab, and they were talking about a restorative response to a situation, and I was just thinking, I couldn't even imagine this. I couldn't even imagine how this would happen. like it in the context in which I'm in. So I'm in the process of sort of trying to bridge that, trying to think because of this approach that I think is very that's represented by the lab approach and by Jennifer's approach of doing exactly what I just described, and that's really thinking about systems and how they're all connected. So I'm really trying to figure that out. I would say that there are I have a couple of preliminary thoughts about what the differences are. One is that I don't know, I've been trying to do some reading on this. Somebody described Canada as a hybrid between the welfare state, the European welfare state, and the US. And I've been trying to dig into the amount of a comparison of philanthropy, particularly corporate philanthropy. Because I know Jen has talked to me about how in the US a program like CHAT can get Blue Cross and Blue Shield funding or other kinds of corporate funding, and that there seems to be less of that available in Canada. And it's certainly the case that there's more government funding available in Canada as compared to the US. So I'm really trying to figure out what those differences might look like, how that plays. I also think that, and I've already suggested the major difference. I think one difference is just the sheer scope of incarceration in the US. I mean, I think it's hard for people in the US to see it, to recognize, and they live it, and much harder, I think, if you're not there to actually understand what has happened to us.
So we might become similar on that in that in Canada, one of the catalysts for our development of justice with these fundamental restorative principles was a statistic that revealed that we incarcerated more young people than the United States. It shocked the conscience. I mean, no better way to Canadians towards Europe than to show them how close we are to the United States or worse.
Right.
But it was an
I read that.
immediate
Yeah.
catalyst
Yeah.
for quite fundamental change in our way of thinking about justice. And I wonder if you're in that. Well, that our statistics for adults are enviable.
Yeah, I think that the focus on police violence, police racialized violence, is obviously significant. You had, corporations were putting BLM signs, on there, and you probably saw that, right? The recognition of the more daily grind and, not the horrific killing of George Floyd, but the way in which the criminal justice system is robbing people of their spirit, of their life, of their meaning is less captures the imagination of the public writ large, and maybe I should say, and of the white public. But that's a little bit wrong because there are lots of poor white men in prison, lots that, though they're not as disproportionate, but there are more white men in prison, right? Because there are more white men than there are men of color. And it's had devastating impact. You saw some change, I think, because of the opioid crisis and where it was hitting rural white America. But I think that it's certainly not going to be because some other country did it better. That's not as likely to have an impact, right? So I think that American exceptionalism is like, I don't think that works. But I do think that I think it really is about mobilizing. I think it really is. That's where the pressure comes from. And I think some of the backlash we see now, you saw the backlash after the wins of the civil rights movement. Then you see this kind of, that's when the incarceration starts going way up, right? Nixon's Southern strategy. And I think we're seeing, some of that. I mean, a lot of what we're hearing from white Christian nationalists, which is, I think, the right way to think about what we're hearing, is law and order. It's about crime. It's about streets, and it's not even the racism is not even dog whistle. It's like blatant. That was not very hopeful, was it? I actually feel more hopeful than that. I mean, I think that there's just a lot of good work. I mean, the work of organizations, think about Insight, which started what? Gosh, in the early 2000s, right? And has had, I think, a tremendous impact. That's a grassroots organization. They don't, not a well-funded kind of organization. And then you think about all the kinds of transformative work that's happened, and you think about the ways in which the changes that I think we've seen in the restorative justice movement to become a movement so much more, or at least sectors of the movement, I should say, so much more focused on racial justice in a way that just wasn't true, 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
Yeah, I have another one. Yeah. Okay, so I'll read it. Crystal would like to know about the nonprofit you founded with regards to changing the way media operates.
Oh.
And maybe you could tell us a little bit about the work that organization does.
Media for Change. Okay, number one, I didn't found it. I was, I didn't create it. I was a board member from its founding, but that's a very different thing. My good pal, Sanjeev Chatterjee, created it. With some assistance from a number of other people, including Shmita Chatterjee, who is his wife. So Sanjeev is a documentary filmmaker, and he is on the faculty at the University of Miami. And so Media for Change was intends to, I shouldn't say intended, I'm no longer on the board, but it continues to sponsor, support, highlight work that uses media to give voice to people whose voices are not heard. So part of what Media for Change has done is to give technical assistance, for example, to community-based organizations and help them get their voices out. It's also sponsored directly more storytelling kinds of things so people can, directly do that. We have work, we have work that it's an international organization. We have work in various parts of India and Europe and Central America, Latin America, and I'm trying to think some other countries too. So that was the work. Yeah. The reimagining thing is a different thing. I mean, it came out of Media for Change, but now it's a separate, has its own little YouTube website, which was back at the beginning, somewhere up here. But it's a set of interviews. Yeah. Okay.
I like this, it wasn't even you.
Oh, there we go. Okay, yeah. It's a set of interviews. You're going to recognize some of those faces, I suspect. That grew from a conference that I helped to create with Lee Goodmark and Marcia Olivo, who's a community organizer back in 2014, called Converge Reimagining the Movement to End Gender Violence. And we brought together more than 200 students, activists, lawyers, scholars, and some of the folks who were doing work in the government all together to have a conversation about reimagining, which was to refocus attention on the structural inequalities that create and maintain violence and away from the criminal system. And so from that is a set of interviews.
So that's.
Okay.
So the idea of Converge and the leadership that you offered to together with others, which is also a mark, I would say, of your bio that's significant in terms of the hope, the places we find hope, is the extent to which you prioritize working collaboratively with others, drawing others in, being part of a vibrant movement that helps us imagine and reimagine differently. Is, I think, where we should end, because I think that's the hope for how we're going to move forward together. It's no small part of that you braved the Halifax weather to continue to forge those connections and relationships so that we can work more together for this kind of change and to imagine a more just world. So I'm so grateful for you being at the lab and for being here tonight and for offering us this really, really important opportunity to learn from all of the research you've done and the work that others have done that you surface for us so that we can be nurtured by that and move forward. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.